So, I'm really, really pleased to be here, and I want to thank, first of all, Donna for all her work to get me here. We first started corresponding in the last year, and then I had this opportunity to come out here and contacted her, and she invited me to come down. Thank you to NOAA Fisheries. Thank you for all the volunteers. It's really quite a production, and I'm very impressed. I'm really a northern person, a northern community person, a northern, I work in Russia, I live in Scotland, I live in Canada. I'm dual US Canadian, but actually I've lived more in Canada. I sort of relate more to northern areas, but it's a treat to get back down here to the southern community. We're both southern communities, Wales and people. And the, as Donna said, this was really an important area for me because my very first talk, I was absolutely terrified. 1976, I had a little bit of data on killer whales from a few seasons and some photos, and was invited to this first Orca conference at Evergreen State College. And I felt like I had to be there. There was, Mike Bing was there, a lot of the early Orca people, Paul Spong, we were all there, and Mark Sears was there as well. We were talking beforehand. Anybody else here that day? No. But anyway, the amazing thing was that after 2 days of the conference, suddenly we get the word, orcas have been captured right outside the conference. I mean, that was so fortuitous that we had all those people there, so unlucky for SeaWorld. That was their, they basically built their own grave with that. That was the end of their work in Puget Sound, much to our pleasure and relief, because they made quite a dent in the southern community populations. So, I'm going to sort of go through my interest in killer whales, going back to some of the early days, and then go up to different stages, and then talk about my work in Russia over the last 15 years. So, for me, it started in 1973 with an engineless sailboat called the Four Winds. Our skipper was a purist, a little bit crazy. He said there's no room for an engine on this boat, and we want to approach the whales in the proper manner. And it's interesting because now I just came from Vancouver where we spent 2 days talking about noise in the water, the problem of putting so much noise in the water. And this has really come to a head now. So we're, these concerns, I guess we were ahead of our time, but it also got us into a lot of trouble. With this no engine, well, we also had no experience. There was one fellow who could sail on the boat out of the four of us. The rest of us were really hopeless to start with. And he actually was good at getting us into trouble. He didn't read weather reports. That's when I first learned to read weather reports and really focus on them, because we were getting into all sorts of trouble. And but he was good at getting us out once we got into trouble, fortunately. We also didn't have much luck and weren't prepared, because we were doing this journey up the BC coast from Victoria. You can imagine we were in Victoria Harbor. We'd spent the whole winter and spring outfitting this boat, putting sound in it, getting ready to go. We raised money from University of Victoria and the federal government on a grant. And there were newspaper stories and everything, we were feted, going out to meet the whales and, do this film. And we headed out, and I've put these little scenes of disaster the corner. I hope you can see them, maybe not on that point, but the first one was off the west coast of Vancouver Island. We had a man overboard. I don't know if I think I put this in the book. Not all of this might be in the book, but I'll tell you the truth this time. Just kidding. He was overboard. Fortunately, we rescued him and got him back in. But we decided going up the west coast in June was probably not a great idea for inexperienced sailors. So we headed up the inside passage instead. However, on the way that night, the skipper, the only one who could sail, turned the boat over to one of us, not myself, but two remained nameless. And he put the boat on the rocks. I flew out of the bunk, I was sleeping at the time, hit the cast iron stove and had a lump, goose-sized lump on my head for the next 10 days or so. And fortunately, it was super, we were able to rocket off the boats in about an hour. And, we're left high and dry and incredibly embarrassed as it would have hit the papers. Also, we were in American waters, which wouldn't have gone down too well. We didn't have, I don't even know if we had our passports. Anyway, so we survived that one. Now, the third scene of disaster was Georgia Strait, heading up there. We got into one of the worst storms of the season. And, we really wondered, those of us who hadn't sailed before, what we were doing on this boat. And, all our carefully prepared contents were spilled into the bilge and, all over the place, and it was just a mess. So this was us high and dry in Vancouver, limping in and trying not to let anybody know we were there, only a few days after we left, and hadn't got anywhere.
Nice.
But after that, things started going a bit better. Couldn't be worse. Now, what was known about orcas at the time? There was a bit of whaling. This was an individual, a male, that was killed off of Cole Harbor in, I think, 1956. But even that, there wasn't that much whaling. We had some idea of stomach contents. The true orca, a lot of people thought they were dangerous. There was a lot of shooting of them in those days by fishermen, by other people. However, the native people, the First Nations people, really did have a handle on who they were, what they were about, and had a lot of, they had a lot of legends about them, but they also had a lot of practical things that they knew about them, that were quite sensible. They did put them on their totems, and this is at Alert Bay, right at the entrance to the cemetery. As I said, we did know about the stomach studies, that they were apex predators. They fed on this huge list of species. And yet, orcas tend to be specialists. Well, we didn't actually know that at the time until we met the orcas in Johnson Strait and started seeing them regularly swimming with minke whales. And that really surprised us, weren't they part of the diet? There was no sense that there were supposed to be separate fish eaters and separate whale hunters, so we really didn't know anything. And all these animals, stellar sea lions, harbor seals, were supposed to be part of the diet too. We heard rumors about lower right-hand corner, the Patagonian orcas thumping these baby sea lions and eating them. So we were quite surprised that ours were fish eaters and very friendly and, completely different than this reputation. Fishing boats of the First Nations people in the top corner, they used to say that they would put their nets, their gill nets in front of or even their seine nets in front of the driving killer whales and be able to have really good catches. You didn't hear that from the white fishermen very often. That was more, they would think of them as being antagonistic. But right away that very first summer, I heard native fishermen saying, yeah, we just put our net out, whales help us drive the stuff in, and we can make a big catch. Now, the other part of the Orcas story, of course, that we were aware of, was that they were being captured for aquariums. And, of course, that had been going on for a few years, and we'd seen them at Sealand and Vancouver Aquarium. These are, on the right-hand side, are scenes from Vancouver Aquarium with Scanna and Hayek, and actually two of the Icelandic orcas that were brought in with Hayek in the last days. And on the left-hand side was the first capture that I witnessed in 1973 with, that was the Southern Community, I believe, that got into Petter Bay. And several of those animals were captured, and we recorded them as well. But I think in the early years that the aquariums did diffuse this killer label. You know, there was a time when I think that this was a valuable thing. But I think when we began to realize how different they were in the wild than in captivity, and we began to see that, you know, Corky was in fact one of the animals that was part of A5 or Top Notch's pod that we were seeing every day in the wild, it suddenly started to sink in that, you know, there was something wrong here. You shouldn't be taking these animals out of their own families. You know, what's the impact on the rest of the family? Of course, we've learned a lot about that now. I just wanted to show this one capture. This was 1970 off Petter Bay, and it was the first white whale capture, a whale called Chimo. This was called Charlie Chin's pod. They were a transient pod. They all had these weird jaw formations. I don't know if you can see in the photo, but the animal has very overshot upper jaw. And Charlie Chin, the big male, had an undershot lower jaw. And then there was another female that looked like she hit the bottom at about 40 knots. Just really twisted upper jaw. And then one perfect looking female. And then Chimo, the white whale, who was about, they reckon, about 2 years old. And it turned out she had this rare genetic condition called Chidiakigashi syndrome. And she died after a couple of years in captivity. May well have died anyway, we don't know. But, you know, Cousteau came, the whole world it was a big news here in the early 1970s. That was her terrible end, really, to have to die in captivity, but she may not have had a long life anyway. Now this was where we found ourselves on July 12, 1973, the Robson Bight, fantastic, unlogged, untouched river valley on eastern Vancouver Island. And the first group of whales we saw were Top Notch's pod, A5, and decided to settle in this valley. I mean, the whales were coming in here 3 or 4 times a day. They were, sometimes we'd come out of the tent in the middle of the night, you know, half naked or even naked, really, in those days. And you just, you know, see the whales splashing in the moonlight, you know, or you'd see all the phosphorescence coming out of the water. And we had hydrophones listening to them. It was a fantastic experience of just living with these whales day in and day out over a summer. That first summer, within about a week of when we were there, Mike Big showed up with his team and started an intensive field study. And we were just so lucky to be up there at the same time. We were doing a film, and we were not biologists, and you know, some of us became more interested after that, but we didn't start out that way. But Mike was learning right from the start about killer whales. And the first two whales in the catalog were A1 and A2, Stubbs and Nicola. These were two older females who were so friendly and really, well, Stubbs was, we think, very old and could not move so fast. So she was often lagging behind the pod and really tolerated us being close and just, we used to watch her doing anti-duty and taking care of the younger ones. And it was really nice to have this highly identifiable whale, because at first we couldn't really tell them apart. They just looked like dots on the horizon, really. The first photos are like that. And then you gradually, after a few weeks, start to see the differences. And at first we thought, well, we'll just be able to get markers of individual ones, and that'll be fine. But Mike Bigg showed that, in fact, every single whale could be identified as an individual. These are some of the other really pronounced dorsal fins that we had at the time. When I first took this photograph, I thought, well, here's a big male in the background with a tall dorsal fin, and a female in the foreground, and a calf. And maybe it's like a traveling playpen. That's the mother and the father, nuclear family. And that's not what it is at all, of course. That's the female, and those are the two progeny. And what we began to realize, over a few seasons coming back to this area, and with Mike Bigg's work, was that these males in the resident type fish eaters were staying with their mothers for life. And the females, if she had a female progeny, that animal would stay with its mother for 10 or 15 years. Then when she started to have calves, she would form a little subpod that might increasingly spend a little bit more time away. And then, I remember interviewing Mike for a National Geographic article in the early 80s, and he was just starting to get the idea that this is how new pod formation might happen over the decades, over the centuries, but realizing, because these animals are so long-lived, that this would be a very, very slow process. Some of the big bulls we had in the pods there, and starting their feeding behavior and traveling. And we started to see that these assemblages were consistent, and also through Mike's thousands and thousands of photographs that he was starting to analyze by the late 70s, early 80s. It was really a numerical game, seeing that these animals were repeatedly traveling together, and then you start to see that those are effectively naturalized. Now, we saw an orca birth in about 1980, and this was photographed. You can just see, I think I did there's a circle around it. Sorry, I'm blocking. You aren't, I did it. But that was brought to, female was brought to the surface with the dorsal fin folded over, and by another individual, not by the mother. So it's just like the textbooks say, which is nice, always nice. And then the dorsal fin came up shortly after. And within, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks, it was quite nice, because the fellow who took the previous photo, Jim Barrowman, who some of you know is one of the, the first whale watch owner and skipper off this coast, full stop, who started in Telegraph Cove. He took the baby photograph, and then a few weeks later brought his baby, who was born almost on the same day, to see the baby orca. So nice little family, human and orca family shot. Of course, we knew that some of these animals were starting to be born in captivity. This was around the same time. And this was Orky, and Corky too was actually the top-notch pod, A5 pod female, who was at Marineland at the time, and she had 5 calves, all of whom died within about a month or 6 weeks, and also a couple of, I believe, stillbirths on top of that, or miscarriages. We think she was too young when she was captured. They need their families, they need a wider support base to be able to give birth and to know what to do. She didn't seem to know what to do, and the aquarium owners didn't either. So that was the story. So the challenge of working with orcas in the wild was really that you had these animals who were at the surface only a small part of the time. All of you who've seen them, you know, it's only 5% of the time that you're actually seeing and trying to interpret what they're doing from that piece of behavior, not knowing, you know, what they're doing down below. And I mean, these are kind of some of the obvious things: breaching and surfacing, a bit of playing, and tail lobbing. But you know, it always used to amaze me when you get in a large ship and you'd be able to have a crow's nest, the number of times you could see whales underwater right next to your boat, right next to your ship, and they didn't actually surface. You know, you didn't realize they were checking you out. They were, and you could see them doing all sorts of things, and you know, not what you would have predicted if you'd only seen them from the surface. I always found that interesting. Orcas sleeping, that was the first time we saw that, the first summer. We had 4 hours at one point, which was fantastic. We were kind of lazy. That was when we actually got our film footage while they were sleeping. It was sort of easy, and that was, we weren't very good at it, so we needed help from the orcas to be able to do it. We had, starting about the end of the second year and into the third summer we were up there, we had these 2 animals called the twins that weren't actually twins, but always hung out together. And I don't know if one of the youngsters had lost its mother, and you know, that's why they were traveling together, because they were nearly the same age. And they just were so drawn to our boat. Every time we had our Zodiac out there, they came right over. When we parked at night and had it moored just offshore, they'd come and sometimes flop against it. You can see here on the left, one of the twins dragging a piece of kelp through its mouth, playing right around the boat, chasing each other. But they kind of led us in and were the closest to us when we found this place called the Rubbing Beach. And we heard about this place, and it was kind of a joke at first, you know, that partly because all of the rocks in northern Vancouver Island, really most of the rocks, are very sharp and barnacle encrusted, and really we didn't have much belief that they were, you know, necessarily rubbing. But we found these tiny stones about the size of a thumbnail in the area, and we're able to see that there were sand patches in this particular beach. And then later on, we found several other beaches right along this area, this same area of Robson Bight, east of Robson Bight. And then in the early 80s, finally photographed them underwater and proved that they were actually rolling along the bottom, and that this was rubbing behavior. It seemed to be something, I mean, it's written about now as being a cultural behavior that was handed down for these, you know, with this particular northern community, because the southern community apparently does not rub, unless they've started since I was last read about them. Okay. There's a little bit of rubbing that's been noted in other parts of the world, but nothing like what we see up here. So these are cultural animals handing down pieces of culture, as it were. Sometimes, a lot of times it's feeding behavior, but it can also be something like this. It can also be acoustic behavior. John Ford started coming up in the late 70s. And we always had the thought, you know, from Paul Spong and from everyone who had been up there, that it seemed that their sounds were different in the different pods, although there was some overlap. But John painstakingly quantified this for his PhD over a number of years, and determined that each pod has its own dialect, and then erected these wonderful structures to show how related the animals probably were based on the number of sounds they show together, they shared together. And then showing that even the three clans in the northern community had no sounds in common, even though they were traveling through the same areas. So after 10 summers in the wild and doing this article on for National Geographic, I wrote the killer whale book. And really the attention switched a lot to the idea of protecting Robson Bight. I think that's in the last chapter, but it carried on even past the first edition of the book, at least. And I wrote a series of articles for magazines and newspapers, particularly in Canada. This is a Canadian issue. The Sitka River Valley, which was unlogged and untouched, was going to be cut down. It was going to be logged. And that was pretty, we were pretty upset about that, but there was, it seemed to be a foregone conclusion. We made our comments known to the plan and, tried what we could do, but there didn't seem to be much. But then we heard that the logs were actually going to be rafted together, brought down the river, and then put into Robson Bight. And the plan was to ship the logs to create something that looked like Beaver Cove, if you know that area, which was full of logs, and create an absolute disaster for the whales. And I did one of the stories I did, I interviewed all the main people involved, John Ford and Mike Bigg, as well as the Fisheries and Oceans people, Bristol Foster, who was then director of the Ecological Reserves. And I tried really hard to interview the logging company to get their view on it, and it was difficult. And then finally I reached the top guy at McMillan Bloedel at night at home. He had a little bit to drink and was surprisingly forthcoming. And he said, that's the way we do business. We ship the logs. We've done it that way on every other valley on eastern Vancouver Island, and that's the way we're going to do it in Robson Bight. And I said, haven't you heard about the killer whales there? And he said, yeah, the killer whales all over go. They'll probably rub on the rocks, on the logs. They'll probably, I told him about the rubbing behavior, and he said, they will probably rub underneath the logs. So that made a nice quote, and he did backtrack from that later on. So we had this big debate in British Columbia, and the question hanging over everything was whether we wanted killer whales or did we want logging, and a lot of us ended up writing a lot more articles and did media interviews and made posters, and we had a big campaign. But for me, it was really interesting because talking to Mike Bigg and John Ford, I learned about the power of expert assessments. We didn't have any definition of core area or critical habitat. We didn't have time to go and do a workshop on it or anything. But they went through their data. And to be fair, they had not actually published on this stuff yet. It was really before they started doing all their publishing. So it was a matter of getting this expert view, and they went through their data and said that Robson Bight is a core area for these killer whales, really important. You've got to set it aside. And I think that finally shifted the responsibility. There was, a sense of responsibility. At least the government felt they couldn't now go ahead with that, and the logging company backed down. Now they still cut the rest of, or a large part of that valley, which is unfortunate, but Robson Bight was okay. Wanted to show them. Imagine that astonishing thought. The only thing is, though, we didn't ask for very much. We were really naive. So the amount of protected area that we got, you can look in the magnifying glass, it's just really a dot. It's about 17 square kilometers. Absolutely pathetic. This was actually my first experience with marine protected areas, working for this, and it really fixed a lot of things in my mind, that whales need habitat, they need protected habitat. And it also made me realize that we had a long way to go in Canada and worldwide. I mean, this was early 1980s. At that time, there were only a handful of areas that protected whales. There was Scammons Lagoon for gray whales. The Mexicans actually were the first to create a whale protected area. And there was Great Barrier Reef, which was created in 1975, not for whales, but it turned out that a lot of whales were there, and they were incorporated in the plan for Great Barrier Reef later on. The Australians were so lucky because they had, Great Barrier Reef is 350,000 square kilometers, compared to 17 square kilometers. That's benchmarking for you. They did it in a big way. And even though they made mistakes, they didn't highly protect enough of it. They didn't zone it at first. They didn't have all their plans in place. They put in a structure that they were able to build on, and they made it better as they've gone along. And they've created protected areas all around Australia of similar size. I mean, I was giving a couple of protected area presentations in Vancouver earlier this week. And the amazing thing is that with the coral reef sanctuary that they've now created outside of Great Barrier Reef, it's now adjoined and made an area of 1.3 million square kilometers. I mean, it's larger than several countries in Europe put together. So that benchmarking, asking enough, asking more than you think you're going to need, in fact, a lot more. Building in precaution, all those things, really, really important. So back to northern Vancouver Island. After I left there, one of the last things, we talked about whale watching. We were actually divided on whale watching. Some of us, and part of myself also thought, do we want to show these whales to people? Do we want to tell people about them? But our experience with the loggers and with that whole situation really taught us that if you don't let people know, there's not going to be any orcas in the future. And whale watching is part of that. So I encouraged Jim Barman to start this whale watching. And I know it's become a big problem off the southern community. It has to be regulated. Whales need areas of their own to be alone. I favor these 1/3 time and space rules. 1/3 of every whale watching area and 1/3 of the daylight time, I think, should be totally reserved for whales. And that's a kind of arbitrary proposal, but I really think something like that needs to be tried, because it's not working. In a lot of places where it gets really busy, it's not working very well the way it is. Now, in late 80s, after a period working with social insects, never mind about that, but I moved to the UK to Scotland. And one of the first things I did was start working for Whale and Dolphin Conservation Society, who were just starting up then. And one of the first things they asked me to do was a report on captive orcas. And they were trying to decide for themselves if they, was captivity sometimes good, sometimes bad? Were there educational things or science that was useful sometimes, or was it all bad, or what was the situation? So I went and visited most of the 17 or 18 aquariums that were then exhibiting killer whales around the world, and wrote this report. And we did decide that the amount of science and education that was done was really minimal, and most of the money goes into maintaining what is an extraordinarily expensive operation, keeping these animals that are really too large to be in captivity. And so we have now been an organization that has opposed capture and captivity for many years. The pictures, some of you will know as Keiko on my travels in about 1992, I think. Yeah, 91. And Keiko was in Mexico City at a place called Reino Aventura. And I remember landing in Mexico and, staying in the center of Mexico, and then thinking I could walk to this aquarium, or, it was probably not very far. Ended up being a 3.5-hour taxi ride, still within Mexico. Still within Mexico, but, this, such a congested city, it's in a bowl, and to have this orca from Iceland, all alone, in this pool. I mean, I think he had a dolphin that he didn't get along with, and also a sea lion there. So they just kept him alone. And when I got back to Scotland and I was writing up my report, one of the first things I had was a call from Warner Brothers, who were trying to do a film on a whale that was going to be released, and they said that they had trouble getting cooperation from SeaWorld. Big surprise. And they tried everywhere, and they were really desperate. They said, we've got the money to do this film, but we don't have an orca. Do you have any ideas? They'd seen my book. And I said, well, there's a whale down in Mexico. And I was thinking, just that this would be some relief from the incredible boredom for Keiko. To have some attention. Never thinking in a million years that he'd be released back into the wild and there'd be all this attention for him and everything else. So that was quite an interesting experience. And I think you all know the story of Keiko. But that was my little tiny contribution to getting Keiko back. I didn't know it would become such a production and take so long to get him back, which is another story. Now, I'd always knew that there were orcas. I mean, all of us knew in the 80s, 70s, 80s, that there were orcas off of Russia. We'd heard stories. There were a few stomach studies. There was no research there. But I was mobilized in the late 90s when I heard that the Nagoya Aquarium was going to capture a lot of Russian orcas. They were talking about 6 or 8 of them for their aquarium. And I was thinking, well, how are we going to study these? Let's try and find out something about them. Let's try and stop these captures some way. I mean, it seemed like an impossible task, but I started writing away to Russian scientists and had no reply except from a couple of them. And one of them, seemed like it was possible that we might be able to work together. I got, at that time I was going back and forth to Japan a lot, working on trying to help set up whale watching there. and was able to help set up a scientific conference in Hokkaido. So I got the Russian scientists invited there. We met, we traveled around Hokkaido together, and somewhere in northern Hokkaido, after about a week of getting to know each other, on the back of a napkin, we sketched out a project to study killer whales. And he thought, maybe we could do it, maybe we could find enough to study, working out of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the main city on the east coast of Russia. So I went back to a couple of NGOs and, wrote to quite a few and finally raised enough money for a pilot study in 1999. And we went up there, and then in 2000, were able to bring a small team of Russian students there. And the way I pitched this, of course, is that they'd never before been studied. They were under threat of capture. We'll give the feedback, sorry. Is that okay? Okay, and that also that there was this great potential comparison to the Canadian-US orcas, where we knew so much, and that we could potentially stimulate Russian science and conservation in the whale field. And I always saw this as a Russian project, essentially, because if you take American or Canadian or outside students, you bring them there, then they go back, and that's the end of it. You have to have people locally working in an area if you're going to have a future for those animals. So I stayed, really strong on that. I was the only non-Russian, except for Hal Sato, you see in the middle, who was involved the first few years. He was a colleague that I worked with for many years in Japan, who did great photo ID, had been up to spend time with Paul Spong at Orca Lab, and had a great affinity for orcas. But these were some of the early Russian students who were involved. Alexander Burden in the lower left corner is co-director of the project. And we set up from a fantastic island south of the main city, about a 7 or 8 hour boat trip south of the city, and started doing photo identification, using the same methods that have been used on this coast, adapting them, teaching them how to do it, and sound recording. We also had land-based theodolite work from a high point. They were really important in terms of identifying the orcas. Later on, we did a little bit of biopsy, but not as a key point of it, certainly in the early years. And so our key research questions as we begun was, do orcas live in small populations, like we were beginning to find out off of Alaska, US and Canada, of fewer than 100 to fewer than 600 individuals? Are there significant capture implications to them? Do they form resident and transients, or is it completely different? Are they carrying high contaminant loads? Are they genetically diverse, or is there a bottleneck? What other threats do they face? Do they have similar systems of dialect? So we had all these questions. Now, to date, we've had tens of thousands of digital photographs, mainly, thousands of hours of sound recordings, more than 350. That's probably well over 400 now. Working days with orcas over 15 years. And we've done a combination of being in one place as well as working. We've had a number of ship transect up the Kamchatka coast, which is an area, I guess, roughly the size of the length of California, just to give you an idea, maybe not quite as much. This was our ship transects. You can't really see them there, but that's an overview and that's a close-up. We didn't want to go further than 12 nautical miles, because every time you do that, you have to send a telegram to Moscow. It's very expensive. So that affected our survey design. But you can see, this is just one season's, or one cruise of 3 weeks, the kinds of things we saw. The only, we probably would normally see more sperm whales and humpback whales times 10 now. I mean, this is already 10, 12 years ago. Humpback whales, as they are along the BC coast, and I think here too, are multiplying and going back to these areas where they probably lived many years. We're seeing so many humpback whales. You can get 30 photo IDs in a day sometimes. So we started, Avacha Gulf was our home base, and we started seeing the same individuals, giving them names and numbers, trying to piece together the matrilines, that they were, see how they were. 600 plus orcas to date, photo ID, different orcas in the resident groups of Avacha Gulf, and only about 20 transients. It's not a big transient area. We think there are more transients, a lot more on the other side of Kamchatka in the Sea of Hoyt, and also further north. I'll tell you in a minute about another area where we're working, where we do see transients regularly. Well, it's called the Commander Islands. So the total of whales from Kamchatka and Commander Islands, 1,500 different orcas. So you get an idea of pretty substantial numbers there. And if you were to include Sea of Okhotsk and further north, you're talking about a few thousand orcas. So sharper numbers than that. And we found out that they have dialects similar to the way they do here. So it's residents, transients, dialects. It's really quite similar. So that's going to be very interesting for comparison purposes. And I put some of the Russian sounds here. So those were monophonic calls, which are used largely for close communication. Then I had one call here at the bottom. I wonder if I can figure it out. It's a biphonic call. I can't seem to find it first. That has a little bit of information. Well, it's biphonic, so there's two different strands coming out, two different tones at the same time. And that's actually, although it doesn't sound loud there, it's actually a really loud call that carries a great distance, and we figure that may be used for pod cohesion at greater distances and when we have maybe a lot of animals in the area. We've done a number of papers on that now, so we're starting to piece together what that is. And those are also found with the residents on this side of the Pacific as well, and in other parts of the world. Now, 2003, several pods of our Avacha orcas were captured a few days after the field season ended. And I want to break my presentation, and I'll come back to it in a minute, just to play you a short video clip. Let's see. I'll just take a second to cue this up. Okay. Some of you may have seen this. It's about 5-6 minutes. But in one respect, the friendliness and intelligence of these has backfired for them. Orcas are now one of the most popular stars of oceanariums, and in recent years there have been several attempts to So that was an extraordinary turning point for us because, we knew those orcas. Here it was, the captors had finally, been able to capture some whales. And our team, they were becoming good scientists, but they were not conservationists until that happened. When that happened, really, they started, they are so anti-captivity now, and they became, after that, it was just, that was the only good result of it. And as a result of that, we've been working on the quotas to try and get them reduced. They do issue quotas every December, and they usually range from about 6 orcas to 10 orcas. However, we were able to get them to not capture any orcas off the east coast of Kamchatka, which was a big step. And probably there would be at least 10 or 15 orcas in captivity, or at least have been attempted to be captured if we hadn't done that, because it ended up marginalizing the capture operations. It made it much more difficult because they had to leave from the port in Petropavlovsk and travel for several days to get into areas where the orcas are much more spread out and difficult to capture. So that has been one positive result, that they're no longer allowed to capture off eastern Kamchatka, and it's really well tracked. Even the attempted captures that have happened in the last few years, we've been able to track the boats, get the numbers of the boats, and see exactly where they go. You can almost see where they're trying to do captures by the zigzag lines and that sort of thing on the tracks. That piece of footage was really valuable. And that was shown within the ministry, and they were really appalled at how this goes on. If we had something like this years ago with SeaWorld, of course we did have it at Bud Inlet. We had Ralph Monroe and all these people who actually saw it. That's a piece of conservation, of huge conservation value, even though it's very depressing or disturbing to watch, especially for our team that knew those animals. So we're hoping now, one of our challenges, or what we're trying to do, is to get residents and transients accepted as separate ecotypes, almost like separate species. And they are in the process. There's a lot of discussion that in the future these may be separate species, along with the Antarctic orcas. And that could be really valuable for conservation, because if you have fewer numbers, then there'll be fewer in the quota, fewer numbers in the quota. But for Russia, it's a great delaying tactic, because if we could get them to agree that, we're actually discussing it at IWC Scientific Committee this month, and we're submitting a Russian paper on this. Then they would have to, the Russian government would have to spend several years reassessing the populations, and there would be no more captures for another 2 or 3 years. As you know, there's one orca that's been captured since then, actually 2, one got away, and another one last year, Narnia, has been named Narnia, who's still in Vladivostok. But there are plans to capture a lot more, and we have rumors that they may be applying for captures of something like 30 or 40 individuals, so really huge numbers, along with the belugas that were captured in the Sea of Okhotsk. So it's something that has doubled, having to redouble our efforts to make sure we can do something about this. So the evidence, when we're trying to prove the resident and transients is really, it's quite obvious to us because we know them, but to try to convince other people, you've got to talk about, diet, site fidelity is really different, morphology, the shape of the animals, as we know, and the genetics and acoustics are really different. So I talked a bit about conservation implications. I was actually presenting some of this in Russia at a conference a couple of years ago. But, the residents, of course, are fish eaters, much larger groups. but are very vulnerable because they're in the same place, vulnerable to live capture fisheries, as we found out with the jays, K's, and L's. The role of breeding females is really strong, and so you need local habitat protection. Transients, smaller fluid groups, marine mammal hunters carrying higher contaminant loads, I think for different reasons they're both completely unsuitable for captivity. It's not a matter of comparing one as more suitable than the other. And of course implications for large prey as well as migratory treaties may apply in terms of their conservation. Now, in 2008, we expanded our Far East Russia Orca project, FARA, to the Commander Islands. You can see here on the map, the Commander Islands are a few hundred miles off the coast, and they're at the end of the Aleutian chain, and they're a fantastic area. It's a marine protected area, the largest one in Russia. For 30 nautical miles around the two islands, there is no fishing, nothing. It's a really highly protected area, and it's full of whales. We see lots of Bell's porpoises there, as well as resident orcas. We see Baird's beaked whales, even close to land. So one of the things we've been able to do is set up a Baird's beaked whale photo ID study, which is the first photo ID study of this species in the world. We now have 130 photo IDs in the catalog, which is fantastic. One thing I want to do right now is ask if there is anybody taking photographs off the west coast of Washington or anywhere, and you have Baird's beaked whale photos or you know about them, please let us know, because there may be possibilities to match these and do collaborations. This species is only found in the North Pacific. Seems to be further offshore here, but yesterday I was meeting with Graham Ellis and John Ford, two of the senior killer whale researchers, and they're giving me their Baird's beaked whale photos that they've managed to collect over the years. They've got only 8 or 10 of them, but they'll be really valuable, be interesting. So killer whales, the problems that they have in this area, even though it's a really remote area, I mean, obviously the captures are a potential problem. There's also intensive fishing of particularly mackerel. These are feeding on salmon largely, but there's also a lot of mackerel feeding. And Russians have cleaned out certain areas where in the early years we were seeing them feeding on mackerel. They're no longer feeding there. They're having to move a little bit further south. It's still a vast area, but it's something that we have to pay attention to. I mean, here's a very well-fed orca from our area. You can see belly full of salmon. The salmon there is really plentiful, but others are a little bit emaciated. And you'll see the ribs on that one. We also have some depredation issues. They're particularly not so much in our area, but on the other side of Kamchatka with halibut and salmon. They are occasionally following those boats and pulling them off the lines, and even sometimes out of nets. And then there's shooting that goes along with that. There is still shooting going on, so there's a big education job to be done. We're starting to give, for 5 or 6 years we've given presentations in all the local schools and tried to educate people both in Commander Islands now and in Kamchatka. We now have 2 teams running separately for these projects. This is a male with a bullet wound to the head, in fact. Still okay, but you don't know if that's festering or what's going to happen. And we get some collapsed fins, which of course happens in other areas of the world. This was our first Abacha Gulf equivalent of Stubbs 01, A1 So it was really quite a shock when his fin fell. So we really want to create this future for orcas and people in the Russian Far East. There's a little bit of whale watching going on, but it's a formidably hard area to get to. So they're not, it's very unlikely it would ever become a problem as it is around here. But I still think, and what we're pushing heavily, is to have whale watch tourism in some areas. You know, we want to learn from some of the problems that have developed in other areas, and really structure it in a way that it will be something that can be sustainable over time. And then just really whales only in other areas. In last February, we had a meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is something I do with my marine protected area work. The Convention on Biological Diversity has a mission to try to protect the high seas, to name important areas on the high seas. And over the last 2 years, they've been going around every part of the ocean and declaring these ecologically or biologically significant areas. Those are EBSAs. And I was so pleased that we could get one of our young Russian biologists to this meeting. And we declared this area in the southeast as an EBSA, agreed by this body of scientists, which should, you know, we've sent now to the Ministry of Natural Resources in Russia. It's a fantastic area, good size. I like to call it the revenge of Robson Bight, because everything we, you know, wanted to have at Robson Bight, we've got, you know, now a sizable potential area. It's not an MPA yet, but it's a starting point. And it's not just killer whales, you know, not just 1,000 or so killer whales in that area, but lots of other whales, you know, fantastic seabirds, you know, full suite of extraordinary wildlife. And the backdrop volcanoes, you know, one of the most active and interesting volcanic areas in the world. And we also have white orcas. We started seeing them mainly in the Commander Islands. It's just an amazing area for white orcas. We first saw a white calf, which you can see, not pure white, but definitely part white. And then we saw this mature female second year. We've seen these animals several times over the last few years. Most years we see at least one of them, especially Mama Tanya. She's named after one of our researchers who was a mama at the same time. So it's probably not a surprise we give our orcas Russian names. But. And then in 2010 we saw Iceberg. It was a full-grown male, which was really fantastic. You know, also realizing that all those years ago, Chimo off southern Vancouver Island died after only 2 years, had Chiedi-Akagashi syndrome. Well, here's a male orca that has obviously survived for 15, 17, 18 years, completely accepted by his family. And this shot you can see traveling behind his mother, maybe a brother beside him. Fish eating pod. Chimo was in a transient pod. Well-adjusted orca, you know, completely accepted, which is fantastic. So we've only seen him a few times, and we looked. I was in Kamchatka and Commander Islands last year for some time. And we did a lot of searching, and we couldn't find him. We were hoping to see him this year, but we don't know. Learn more about it. Whether he's a true albino or not, we don't know for sure. Probably not. But anyway, an extraordinarily beautiful animal. So I wanted to show. I'm nearly finished. I wanted to show this photograph. This is our senior acoustics researcher, Olga Filatova, who is an amazing person. She was our very first researcher, first one to get a MSc and a PhD through the project. We've now had 10 MScs and it's coming up to 6 PhDs through Moscow State University and St. Petersburg State University. Olga actually, after 2 years in the project, got leukemia, lymphoma, and it's extraordinary that she even survived. She didn't have much money. We pulled our money even from the research to get her to a clinic in the Ural Mountains, and she pulled through. We would have a fraction of the papers we have today if she hadn't survived, and she's fine and healthy now. But that was we've gone through a lot of bumps with the project, but it's now really strong. Now this photo means a lot to me. This is from the top of Bering Island, where Bering and his men were stranded in 1741. And I visited Bering's grave when I was there. And this is the MPA, the Marine Protected Area, the reserve. And the whole time I was there, I didn't see a single boat, except for our little boat going out. Sometimes we go out 16, 17 kilometers offshore. We went the full length of the island and around, not a single boat, not a passing freighter, no fish boat, nothing. Nothing overhead either, no planes. And I think we need more areas like this around the world. We also need to have development and to, build it into marine protection, but we do need some pristine areas, more of them. What we did see in this area was whales all the time. Well, when it wasn't foggy. But that's maybe 1 out of every 3 days is foggy or a little bit too rough. But if you actually know they're out there and you can hear them in a hydrophone down, you can always hear them. So it's a really magical place. So I'd be happy, I want to tell you one last thing. Was 40 years ago this month, or within 2 weeks, was when I first started studying killer whales. The first slides I was showing you. And one of the first pods we met were the A's, the A5. And a couple years ago, I took my family back. I have 4 children, and my wife. We've been watching whales in other parts of the world. I go to Iceland a lot, and Japan, and Mediterranean, and they'd seen whales, but they hadn't come back to Johnson Strait. And we went out with Jim Barrowman, and using his slow whale watching method, puttering out from shore, and there's A5 pod with Sitka, 62 years old, one of the whales that I first seen that first summer. And I remember writing, that when we started to realize that these animals were so long-lived, I remember writing, someday we'll be able to take our children and we'll stay with them a long time. So thank you very much. Fantastic audience. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about northern whales. Yes, Bonnie.
They look a lot different, I know, from people's posters, especially people poster over here, that the Antarctic whales are quite different looking. Are your Russian whales different looking than ours in the Antarctic?
Yeah, the question is, do the Russian whales look different than the whales, resident whales over here? And, comparing on Hugo Gorter's fantastic poster, you can see there's a lot of differences with Antarctic. They're very close, I think, in size and appearance to the resident and the transient Orcas. It's really remarkably similar. They must have been together at one point, I like to say, though, that the dialects are completely different. They have the Russian accents. So that's the difference, yeah. Canadian and American are a little different. Other questions? Yes?
Well, you mentioned that iceberg might not be a true albino. So what's a true albino and what's the difference?
The question is whether iceberg is a true albino or not, and what makes the difference. Well, I'm not an expert on albinism, but what I understand is that if we were to show that, we could show it genetically. If he had a pink eye, you know, you could tell that. Then it also might mean that his immune system is compromised. We have a feeling, you know, as albinism is in most mammals. You know, a lot of the diseases that and conditions that orcas experience, you know, as we've learned, are similar to our own. You know, we're all in the same environment. You know, we're all actually a huge experiment in, you know, what the toxic stuff we put into the air and the water. And, you know, that experiment is only ongoing. You know, most of us, through our lifetimes, that's when that stuff started happening at a you know, significant level. And it will remain to be seen, you know, what's going to happen to us and to them if there are long-term consequences to a lot of this stuff. But, you know, back to your question, it's, you know, could well be partial albinism, and maybe it's a good sign that he's a full-grown, mature animal. You know, the Chimo, the one that was in captivity, who had Chidiac-Agashi syndrome, was called a partial albino also, but had this genetic condition that caused that partial albinism. But it's difficult with a wild animal, and you don't want to be too invasive. You know, we're very, very nervous about being invasive. You know, we don't like invasive research. We like to stand back and see what we can learn from traditional photo ID and acoustics. Yes? Yes, in the back row.
Surprised at the total number found in the Russian waters?
Yeah, are we surprised with the total number we found in the Russian waters? Yes, I am. I mean, I think it's a sign that they are healthier in terms of numbers. But it is a fairly vast area. I think it's also worth pointing out that probably 2,000 were taken out of Japanese waters and maybe southern Kuriles over from about the 1930s to the 60s, and taken in small whale fisheries. And, you know, I always point that out. Also, you know, Norway took 2,000. And if you think about those numbers, they, you know, to us, when we first started studying orcas, I remember coming across those numbers and thinking, well, that's tiny compared to blue whales. But now what we know about orcas and the small populations that they exist in, they probably took quite a few complete pods and even a few complete communities. So that's, you know, until you do studies on an animal, you just don't have any idea what you're doing. But yeah, we're glad that the numbers are healthy there. But they do have, you know, orcas everywhere in the world are at fairly low numbers. You can't really play around with that too much, you know, without losing them. If you look at the breeding units. Yes, Sarah?
My son wonders about the dorsal fin that flopped in the wild. Is anything known about that at all? What kind of?
I don't know, no. And we have all sorts of theories about captivity, and I don't know if that's definitive or not. You know, the way they were circling around, perhaps the lack of activity. But, you know, in the wild, why would it happen there? I don't know. It could be some genetic thing that in that particular group, you know, doesn't seem to be an injury. But other questions? Yes.
Is there any difference between fecal samples or non-invasive?
Yeah. I mean, we try to get it, but it's not. I don't know. We haven't had much luck. You know, some people seem to be good at that. I don't know, I haven't pushed my team enough, maybe. You know, maybe they're not encouraged to get a dog, I know. We have a house, we have a cat. Doesn't quite work. But our cat on the Commander Islands, our cat keeps the mice and also the foxes. We have these Arctic foxes that come around, and they're really cute. You know, they're sort of blue tinged hair. You know, Steller in his journals, if you know, Wilhelm Steller was the naturalist on the Bering expedition on Bering Island that terrible winter of 1741-42, when a third of the expedition died of scurvy. And Steller describes these foxes really vividly, and they were all a pest, always coming around. Well, our cat can deal with them. So, I mean, the foxes still kind of snoop at the edges, and they're great to see. You know, you go out for a run on the beach, which I was doing, trying to increase the number of whales I've seen while jogging along the beach from 1 to 2 or 3. The foxes will kind of trail you a little bit and look up above. So I don't know if I answered your question. Did I forget your question? No. So anyway, yes? Did you have a question back there?
I was wondering about the drooping dorsal fins. Why do you think that is? You mentioned that in the slides.
Yeah.
Why are you seeing drooping dorsal fins?
I can't repeat.
The drooping dorsal.
Oh, drooping.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is something that happens all over the world sometimes. We will get some animals. I mean, there was this iPod. I think they've changed the numbering of that, but we always called them iPod. And they had collapsed fins off northern Vancouver Island. A couple of them. I mean, one of them had a curled over fin. You could look down and look like looking down a tunnel, you know, when you saw it from behind. It may be a genetic thing. Anyone else? Yes?
I thought that maybe you said that we could hear Patrick. Did you say, is iceberg a resident north? Or is it resident out for the first time?
Yeah. The question is if Iceberg is a resident orca. Yes, he's resident fish-eating type of orca. And the pod is about 10 or 12 individuals, as far as we can tell. But not resident to where we are. He probably his core range is further north of Bering Island, we figure, but we don't know. We hope we can continue to, expand a little bit, at least to do some more bigger surveys to see where some of the other ones go. Yes,
I think you mentioned with the residents of salmon and mackerel.
Yes.
The extent of their diet, or is there
No, we haven't had, the question is the salmon and mackerel the extent of their diet? I think we're seeing, we've certainly seen a lot of salmon hunting and mackerel hunting. And we can, even lots of photographs with the prey in their mouth. We haven't seen very much of anything else. There may be a little bit more fishing for bottom fish. We've, last night when I was talking to Graham Ellis and John Ford, they were just on their way to northwest Queen Charlotte Islands to look for offshores. And offshores are this third ecotype that feed on sharks. And they were showing us pictures of the fins, with the worn down teeth that they have even after 10 or 15 years old. Their teeth are already worn down from feeding on these sleeper sharks. But we haven't found any evidence of offshores. We've looked, hopefully we might find something like that. And Graham and John said the closest, the furthest they've heard of them is kind of the middle to eastern Aleutians, and not on the other side of the Aleutians. And we are actually, you have to go to the end of the Aleutian chain, and then it's another few photo ID almost any animal. They do it with insects too, and it's extraordinary. So how are we doing for time? We're late, aren't we?
No, right on.
Are we? Okay. Well, thank you again, everybody.